The city at night was a creature of electric veins and concrete bones, a symphony of ambition and decay. In its glittering heart, nestled among towers of cold steel and glass, stood Bella Notte, a restaurant where the maitre d' spoke in whispers and the price of a bottle of wine could cover a month's rent in the wrong part of town. It was a stage, and tonight's principal actor held court in the velvet-shrouded gloom of the back corner booth. His name was Lysander Varga, though in the hushed, fearful circles that knew of him, he was simply Sander. At 28, he commanded an empire built on inherited ruthlessness and sharpened instinct. His face was the kind of handsome that served as a warning, all sharp angles, a severe mouth, and eyes the color of a winter sea at dusk. They missed nothing. Beside his table, a living, breathing piece of his legend sat Sentinel. Goliath was not a pet, he was a statement. 140 pounds of dense muscle and midnight black fur, a cane Corso whose reputation was as meticulously cultivated as his master's. The dog didn't sleep, didn't pant with amiable boredom. He was a statue of latent violence, his massive head following the movements of every server, every busboy, with a predator's chilling focus. A low, continuous rumble, like distant thunder, vibrated from his chest, a sound that made the fine crystal on the tables shiver. The staff gave the beast a berth so wide it created an invisible moat around Sander's table. The meeting was not going well. A man with sweat beading on his thinning hairline was talking too fast, his hands fluttering over the white linen like startled birds. He was explaining a deficit, a shipping delay, a weak excuse that dissolved in the air between them. Sander listened in a silence so profound it was louder than any shout. He held a single ice cube in a cut crystal glass, turning it slowly, the clink a death knell. His associate, Nikolai, a silver-haired man with the weary eyes of a historian of violence, watched from the other side, offering nothing. "You understand," the sweating man pleaded, his voice cracking, the storm in the port, the customs officer who had to be persuaded. It took time. Sander's gaze lifted from the ice cube and settled on the man. He didn't need to speak. The message was transmitted in that glacial look, "Your time has just run out." It was into this charged atmosphere that she was forced to walk. Julietchen moved through the dining room with an economy of motion learned from double shifts and perpetual fatigue. The black dress all the waitresses wore was a size too big for her slender frame, the apron tied tightly around her waist the only thing giving it shape. Her dark hair was swept into a knot that was beginning to fray at the nape of her neck. Her face, while striking, was marked not by cosmetics but by a quiet, watchful endurance. She carried a bottle of a '95 Brunello, a vintage worth more than her car, toward the Devil's Corner. She felt the ripple of tension, saw the other servers exchange glances of pity and relief that it wasn't them. She saw Goliath first, a wall of shadow and intent. The growl intensified as she approached, a sonic barrier meant to repel. The man at the table didn't even look at her, he was too busy drowning in Sander's gaze. Nikolai gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning. Juliet took a breath. She didn't look at the dog, not directly. Instead, she focused on the space beside the table, on the task. As she drew within the danger zone, she did something inexplicable. In a voice barely above a whisper, a tone used for skittish strays at the shelter where she spent her mornings, she murmured, "Easy, big guy. Just passing through." The words were nonsense. The tone was everything. It was calm, devoid of fear, a simple acknowledgement. She didn't stop moving, her focus on presenting the bottle to Nikolai for inspection. But the effect was momentary, a flicker. Goliath's head tilted a fraction, the thunder in his chest hitching. It was enough. She presented the wine, went through the ritual. As Nikolai nodded, she stepped back to pour. It was then that the sweating man, desperate to deflect, made a sudden, jerking gesture of supplication. His elbow caught the edge of her tray. The world tilted into slow motion. The beautiful, heavy bottle of Brunello toppled, a dark ruby arc of impossible value splashing across the immaculate linen, splattering Sander's sleeve, and pooling on the floor like blood. The silence that followed was absolute. The sweating man looked as if he might vomit. Nikolai closed his eyes. The rumble from Goliath erupted into a definitive, ear-splitting snarl, the dog surging to its feet, lips peeled back from teeth designed for destruction. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The debt she couldn't pay just got exponentially worse. But a lifetime of facing down worse terrors than a spoiled rich man, bill collectors, her brother's dealers, pure despair, had forged a strange steel in her spine. She didn't cower. She righted the empty bottle, set it carefully on the tray. A hand shot out, faster than a snake, encircling her wrist. The grip was iron, cold, and absolute. It yanked her forward, forcing her off balance, bending her over the ruined table. Her eyes met his. Up close, Lysander Varga was even more terrifying. The winter sea eyes were a blizzard, freezing her in place. The scent of him, expensive wool, spice, and beneath it, the crisp, clean smell of gun oil, filled her senses. The wine dripped from his sleeve onto her skin. "You," he said, the single word a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. "What is your name?" The air crackled. Every instinct screamed to give a false one, to hide. But something in his gaze, a challenge, a demand for the smallest shred of truth in this theater of lies, made her speak. She met the blizzard head-on, her own gaze not defiant, but eerily steady. "Mira," she said, plucking the name from the air, from the restaurant's own sign. "Bella Notte. Mirage." He held her there for a century, his thumb pressing against the frantic pulse in her wrist. He saw the fear, she couldn't hide that, but he also saw the absence of panic, the unwavering stillness beneath it. It was more intriguing than any show of bravery. A waitress who spilled a fortune in wine and didn't beg. With a contemptuous flick, he released her. "Clean it up, Mira," he said, the false name a deliberate insult. He turned his attention back to the sweating man, dismissing her as one would a malfunctioning appliance. "Now, where were we? You were explaining your failure." Juliet, her wrist burning, knelt and began picking up the shards of crystal, mopping the expensive stain with a cloth that was now ruined. She worked methodically, a silent ghost in the carnage of the evening. As she worked, she felt the weight of his gaze return to her, not on her face, but on the nape of her neck, a palpable, considering pressure. She had passed through the monster's moat and spilled its wine. And in doing so, she had, for a single, fatal moment, made the beast in the corner hesitate. She finished, stood, and walked away without a backward glance, the echo of Goliath's final, puzzled whine and the ice-cold memory of Sanders' touch following her into the bright, false safety of the kitchen. The door swung shut behind her, muffling the sound of the sweating man sobbing apologies. She leaned against the stainless steel wall, letting out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. A terrible mistake, survived. She was wrong. For Lysander Varga, it was not an end. It was an opening move. Before the ruined tablecloth had even been taken away, he caught Nikolai's eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the kitchen doors. The command was silent, but clear, find her. Find out everything the game, unbeknownst to the waitress with the steady hands and the liar's name, had just begun. The sanctuary of the kitchen was a world away from the cathedral hush of the dining room, a cacophony of hissing steam, clanging pans, and shouted orders in 3 languages. For a moment, Juliet Chen simply let the noise wash over her, a welcome, ordinary chaos after the frozen, predatory silence of the corner booth. Her wrist still throbbed where his fingers had dug in, a phantom brand. Mira, he'd tasted the lie on her tongue and had thrown it back at her like a piece of gristle. She forced her breathing to slow, the practiced calm she used with frightened animals settling over her like a shield. The head waiter, a man named Marco with perpetually worried eyes, descended upon her, hissing about the cost, about the client, about her future which, he assured her, was now terminally brief at Bella Notte. She absorbed the tirade with a numb nod, her mind already miles away, in a cramped apartment in a building that always smelled of damp and stale frying oil. The real cost wasn't the bottle of wine, it was the shift's pay she'd undoubtedly forfeit, the gap in her meticulously calculated budget that would now mean choosing between Raphael's medication and the looming interest payment to Vic, the loan shark whose smile showed too many gold teeth. She finished her shift in a blur, cleaning tables with a mechanical efficiency, the other servers offering silent, sidelong glances of sympathy and morbid curiosity. The story was already spreading. Juliet spilled a fortune on the Varga guy's suit. She's dead. Or worse. The "or worse" was what truly haunted the walk home. The city shed its glittering skin block by block. The clean lines of the financial district gave way to the crumbling brick and flickering neon of the quarter. Here, the shadows had texture and intention. Every alley mouth seemed to hold a watchful stillness. She clutched her keys between her knuckles, a pathetic urban talisman, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty streets. The debt to Vic wasn't just a number on a ledger, it was a living entity that followed her, its breath on her neck. It had begun with Raphael's desperate attempt to dig himself out of a smaller hole with a lucky bet, a bet that had spiraled into a nightmare of compounded vig and threats that left bruises not just on her brother's body, but on his spirit. She reached her building, the entryway light long since shattered, and took the stairs two at a time, the old wood groaning in protest. The silence on her floor was too deep. Usually, she could hear the faint blare of Raphael's television, the sad, tinny soundtrack of his insomnia. Tonight, there was nothing. A cold dread, sharper than any fear she'd felt under Sanders' gaze, coiled in her stomach. Her key scraped in the lock, and she pushed the door open. The scene inside was one of controlled devastation. Nothing was overturned, no lamps shattered in theatrical fury. That was Vic's style, he preferred the terrorism of implication. The apartment had been searched, with a brutal, invasive thoroughness. Cushions were slid open, their cheap foam guts spilling onto the floor. Drawers hung open, their contents, socks, utensils, old photos, dumped in piles. In the center of the room, on the scarred coffee table, a single item sat placed with deliberate care, Raphael's beloved vintage record player, the one thing of value he owned, its turntable snapped clean in half. And then, from the dark mouth of the hallway, her brother emerged. Raphael Chen was 22 but looked decades older in that moment. One eye was swollen shut, a livid purple and yellow moon. A cut split his lip, and he held his ribs with a careful, hitching breath. But it was his eyes, the one that could still see, that undid her. They held a depth of shame and terror so profound it was like looking into an abyss. "Jules," he whispered, the word slurred by his swollen mouth. "They came. They knew everything. The payment. It's not next week. It's now. All of it." All of it? The figure was astronomical. Impossible. It was a sum designed to be impossible, the true point of the exercise. How much time did they give us? He flinched. "Sunrise," he said he'd take me to the river docks. That you could come identify what the fish left behind. The dread crystallized into a hard, cold diamond in her chest. This was it. The end of the road of bad options. She had no more favors to call in, no more assets to pawn. Her body went on autopilot. She fetched the first aid kit, began dabbing at his cuts with antiseptic that made him hiss. Her mind, however, raced down dark, futile alleys. Could they run? Where, and with what money? Could she reason with Vic? The man was a reptile, reason was a currency he didn't trade in. The night bled away in a vigil of silent despair. She packed 2 duffel bags with a frantic, useless energy. As the first dirty gray light of dawn smeared itself across the window, they sat on the gutted couch, waiting for the knock. It came not as a pounding threat, but as a single, polite, and therefore utterly terrifying, tap tap tap. Juliet rose, her legs leaden. She opened the door, bracing for Vic's gold-toothed leer. Instead, she found Nikolai. He stood in the grimy hallway like a visitor from another planet. His overcoat was impeccably tailored, charcoal gray, untouched by the building's grime. His silver hair was combed back with precision. In his gloved hands, he held a simple, legal-sized envelope. His weary eyes took in the devastation of the apartment, the broken boy on the couch, and finally, Juliet herself, still in her stained waitress uniform from hours before. There was no pity in his gaze, only a kind of resigned assessment. "Juliet Chen," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was calm, deep, carrying no need to raise itself above a whisper. "My employer, Lysander Varga, has purchased your brother's debt from its previous holder. All associated obligations have been transferred." The words made no sense. They hung in the foul air, incomprehensible. Purchased? Transferred? Vic was a monster, but he was a known, local monster. This was something else entirely, a shadow moving from the deep ocean into her shallow, desperate pond. Nikolai extended the envelope. "The terms of settlement are contained herein. In summary, the principal, plus all accrued vigorish, is to be considered a forward advance against services to be rendered. You will accompany me now. You will reside at the Varga estate for a period not to exceed 1 calendar year, acting in a domestic capacity. Upon satisfactory completion of this tenure, the debt will be considered extinguished in full. Juliet's hand trembled as she took the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. She didn't open it. The legal language was just a veneer over the raw truth. She had been bought. What kind of domestic capacity? For the first time, a flicker of something, not emotion, but perhaps a shadow of it, passed over Nikolai's face. The primary duty will be the care and maintenance of Mr. Varga's canine, Goliath. The animal has proven difficult to manage for previous handlers. Your unique rapport was noted. A hysterical laugh clawed at her throat. The dog. It was about the dog. Her moment of instinctive calm in the restaurant had not been an escape, it had been an audition. One she had passed. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely her own. Nikolai's gaze drifted past her to Raphael, who was shaking, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dried blood on his face. "Then the debt reverts to its original terms, payable immediately, to Mr. Varga. The consequences of default, I assure you, will be far more severe and final than anything your previous creditor could envision." He let that sink in, the ice in his words freezing the very air. "You have 5 minutes to gather personal effects. Only what you can carry. Your brother will remain. He is the collateral for your compliance." The choice was no choice at all. It was a slow walk to the gallows versus a firing squad on the spot. She looked at Raphael, at the broken record player, a symbol of all the broken things in their lives. She saw the pleading in his one good eye, not for her to stay, but for her to go, to make this nightmare stop. Without another word, Juliet turned and walked to her room. She emptied her waitress apron pockets onto her dresser, a few crumpled bills, some coins, her keys. She changed into jeans, a simple t-shirt, and a worn sweater. She packed a small bag with underwear, socks, a photograph of her parents, a book on animal behavior she'd been meaning to read. It took less than 3 minutes. She went to Raphael, knelt before him, and pressed her forehead to his. "You stay inside. You lock this door. You go to your job when you can. You live, Rafa. However you have to, you live. This ends now." She stood, shouldered her bag, and walked to the door where Nikolai waited, a silent, elegant reaper. She did not look back. As she followed him down the decaying stairs, the envelope clutched in her white-knuckled hand, the reality of her situation settled upon her with the weight of a tombstone. She had exchanged a loud, vulgar monster for a quiet, elegant one. She had left the world of desperate chaos for a world of cold, calculated order. And her prison, she understood as a sleek, black sedan with tinted windows purred at the curb, would not be one of cracked plaster and peeling linoleum. It would be gilded, silent, and guarded by a beast whose teeth she had already, foolishly, glimpsed. The drive toward the heart of Lysander Varga's domain was a journey into a deeper, darker night. The black sedan did not navigate the city so much as it parted it, a shark moving through lesser waters. Juliet sat in the cool, leather-scented silence, watching the familiar, painful landmarks of her life blur and vanish. The grocery store where she clipped coupons, the bus stop where she'd wait in the rain, the shelter's faded sign, all swallowed by the smooth, relentless motion. Nikolai did not speak. The driver, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, stared ahead as if she were merely cargo. The envelope lay unopened on her lap, a sealed verdict. She had no desire to read the fine print of her own indenture. The cityscape began to change. The cramped buildings gave way to wider streets, then to high walls crowned with iron spikes or coiled razor wire. They passed through a security gate of wrought iron that swung open soundlessly, manned by unsmiling men in dark clothing. The road beyond was a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through manicured grounds, lit by soft, low-glowing lamps that sculpted ancient oaks and dormant gardens from the pre-dawn gloom. At the end of the drive, the Varga estate rose not as a classical mansion, but as a monument to severe modernity. It was all sharp angles, expanses of glass reflecting the dark sky, and pale concrete, looking less like a home and more like a fortress designed by a minimalist architect. It was beautiful in the way a honed blade is beautiful, cold, precise, and utterly functional. The car stopped before a sweeping staircase. Nikolai exited and held the door for her. The air here was different, clean, cold, and utterly still, devoid of the city's constant hum. "Follow me," he said, his voice the only sound. They did not enter through the grand front doors, but veered around the side, down a covered walkway of polished stone. Their destination was a secondary wing, its entrance a heavy, reinforced steel door with a keypad. Nikolai typed a code, the lock disengaged with a solid thunk, and he led her into a sterile, utilitarian hallway. This was the underbelly of the beautiful beast, the staff quarters, the machinery of the prison. He stopped at a plain door, opened it, and stood aside. The room within was small, but not ungenerous. It contained a single bed with a plain gray coverlet, a simple desk and chair, a wardrobe, and a door leading to a small, tiled bathroom. There were no windows. A single recessed light in the ceiling provided a muted, shadowless glow. It was a cell in a very high-end asylum. On the desk lay a folded stack of dark clothing, simple trousers and tunics, practical and uniform-like. "These are your quarters," Nikolai stated. "You are not to leave this wing unless escorted or for your designated duties. Meals will be brought to you here at appropriate times. The estate is under constant surveillance. Do not attempt to explore." He handed her a small, sleek electronic fob on a wrist coil. "This unlocks your room and the exterior door to the kennel run only. It is geofenced and will not function on any other locks." Juliet placed her meager bag on the bed, the finality of the gesture hollow. "And my duties? With the dog?" "Goliath is housed in the secure kennel facility at the rear of the grounds. You will report there at 0700. Your sole responsibility is his care, feeding, exercise, grooming. A schedule and dietary instructions are in the folder on the desk." He paused, his eyes holding hers. 2 previous handlers were employed in this role. The first required extensive reconstructive surgery on his forearm. The second left the estate and has not been seen since. Mr. Varga was impressed by your composure. Do not mistake that for invulnerability. The animal is not a pet. It is a weapon that resides here. You are to maintain the weapon. Nothing more. With that, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound of the automatic lock engaging was a soft, definitive sigh. Juliet stood motionless in the center of the room, enveloped by a silence so profound she could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. She was here. Sold, delivered, and locked in. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she had foregone years ago. Instead, she unpacked her bag with methodical care, placing her few belongings in the wardrobe. She changed into the provided clothes, they fit with a generic, impersonal adequacy. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for 0700. When the time came, the door lock disengaged with the same soft thunk. She stepped out into the empty hallway, following painted arrows on the wall that led to a secure rear exit. The morning air outside was biting, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. The kennel was 100 yards away, a low, formidable-looking structure of concrete and steel bars, surrounded by a double-fenced run. As she approached, the silence was broken not by barking, but by a deep, resonant boom as something heavy threw itself against the interior metal door. Her heart hammered, a primal response. She used the fob on a gate, then on the outer door of the kennel itself. The interior was dim, climate-controlled, and smelled of antiseptic, high-grade meat, and raw animal power. In a run that was more a vault, behind bars as thick as her wrist, stood Goliath. He was even more immense up close, a distillation of pure, muscular intent. He did not bark. He stared, the low growl building again from the depths of his chest, a sound that vibrated in the bones of the building. His eyes were fixed on her, devoid of anything she recognized as canine emotion, no curiosity, no playfulness, only a focused, simmering threat. A metal cart sat nearby, laden with a bowl of raw, finely chopped meat, supplements, a jug of water, grooming tools, and a heavy-duty leash and harness that looked like something used to restrain a bear. The protocol was clear: slide the bowl into the run via a secure drawer, refill the water from an external hookup, clean the run with a hose and squeegee from the outside. No contact. No entry. Juliet looked from the cart to the dog. She looked at the perfect, sterile misery of his environment. She thought of the frightened, aggressive dogs at the shelter, the ones labeled unadoptable. She remembered the garden at the estate, the glimpse of green she'd seen from the car. Ignoring the cart, she walked to a supply closet and found what she was looking for: a faded, clean horse blanket. She carried it back, and under the laser-focused gaze of the beast, she slowly, deliberately, sat down on the concrete floor several feet from the bars. She spread the blanket beside her, a gesture of claimed territory. Then, from the pocket of her tunic, she pulled out her book, the Animal Behavior Text. She opened it to a random page, settled her back against the wall, and began to read aloud. Her voice, in the stark space, was a foreign sound. She did not speak to the dog. She did not coo or try to soothe. She simply read, in a calm, monotone murmur, about the psychological effects of environmental enrichment on captive predators. Chapter 7, Stimulus and Response. An environment devoid of positive stimuli can amplify latent aggression and create a feedback loop of anxiety and territoriality. For 10 minutes, nothing changed. The growl continued. The massive head tracked her every tiny movement. Then, the growl wavered. It dropped in pitch, becoming less a continuous threat and more a sporadic rumble of confusion. The dog's head tilted, just as it had in the restaurant. The unblinking stare held a new intensity, not diminished threat, but a profound, puzzled focus. "What is this?" the posture seemed to scream. "You are not throwing meat. You are not hosing my den. You are not running. What are you, asterisk?" Juliet turned a page, her voice steady. She created a bubble of mundane, non-threatening activity in the heart of his fortified world. She was not a handler. She was not a master. She was a strange, quiet rock in his stream of predictable hostility. After 30 minutes, she closed the book, stood up, and folded the blanket. Goliath immediately tensed, the growl returning full force. She ignored him, walking to the cart. She prepared his food, slid the bowl into the run. He did not move toward it until she had stepped back to the door, her hand on the handle. Only then did he stalk to the bowl, his eyes still locked on her, and began to eat with a swift, mechanical efficiency. She left the kennel, the morning sun now bright and mocking overhead. Back in her room, the lock engaged once more. She had not tamed anything. She had not even touched the beast. But she had established a precedent. In the economy of fear and power that ruled this estate, she had introduced a new, utterly baffling currency: passive, unwavering calm. And somewhere, in a control room lined with monitors, Lysander Varga leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the feed from the kennel, replaying the scene of the waitress on the floor with her book. The ice in his glass remained unturned. For the first time in a long time, someone in his world had done something he could not immediately predict. And it was this, more than any show of defiance, that truly captured his attention. The weapon had been presented with a puzzle, and the weapon had paused. The implications of that pause were far more dangerous than any snarl. The days bled into a rhythm of silent observation and calibrated routine. Juliet became a ghost in the machine of the Varga estate, her world circumscribed by the windowless room, the stark hallway, and the concrete kennel. She adhered to the schedule with monastic precision, but she had rewritten the script of her duty. Each morning, she would enter Goliath's domain, not as a keeper, but as an unmoving landmark. She brought the blanket, her book, and her unnerving quiet. She read aloud from texts on ethology, on the history of working breeds, even, on one day, a collection of bland poetry. She was a phenomenon, as steady and inexplicable as a rock in a torrent. The change in the animal was glacial, but it was real. The perpetual growl had ceased. Now, her entrance was met with a watchful, intense silence. He would stand at the back of his run, a statue of obsidian muscle, tracking her. He no longer charged the bars when she moved to fill his water. He would wait, statuesque, until she resumed her seat before approaching the bowl. It was not trust. It was a wary, baffled truce. She had proven herself to be a non-threat that refused to be threatened, a paradox his conditioned mind was struggling to compute. Unbeknownst to her, she had an audience of one for every moment of this strange ballet. Lysander Varga's study was a room of shadows and screens, one wall a mosaic of high-definition feeds from every corner of his domain. The kennel camera was rarely off. He watched her read. He watched the infinitesimal relaxation in Goliath's powerful shoulders. He watched her ignore the beast with a focus so complete it became its own form of power. It gnawed at him. This waitress, this debtor, was operating on a frequency he couldn't jam. Her calm was an insult to the ecosystem of fear he had meticulously cultivated. Nikolai's warnings about distraction, about vulnerability, echoed in his mind, but were drowned out by a more primal urge, to crack her composure, to see the fear he knew must be lurking beneath, to prove that his world could break anything. On the 7th day, he went to the kennel. He arrived silently, a spectre in a black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, appearing in the doorway just as Juliet was folding her blanket after the morning session. The air in the room changed instantly, charged with a new, volatile energy. Goliath, who had been lying down, his head on his paws watching her, surged to his feet. But he did not growl at his master. Instead, a low whine, almost inaudible, escaped him, and his powerful tail gave a single, stiff wag before stilling. The animal's focus split between the two humans, a living wire of tension. Juliet felt his presence before she saw him, a pressure, a cold spot in the room. She turned slowly, her face a careful blank. He leaned against the doorjamb, his arms crossed, his winter sea eyes sweeping over her, then over his dog, then back to her. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor. "He's not eating his supplement," Sanders said, his voice cutting the quiet. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of failure. Juliet looked at the bowl. The powdered supplement was neatly pushed to the side. "He doesn't like the taste. It's bitter. You could mix it with a little plain yogurt. He'd take it then." A flicker of something dark passed over his face. She was solving his problem. She was instructing him. "You think this is a partnership?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "You think you've tamed him with your little bedtime stories?" "No," she replied, meeting his gaze. There was no challenge in it, only a flat, factual honesty that was somehow more infuriating. "I haven't tamed him. I've just given him something else to think about besides how to kill the next person who walks through that door." He pushed off from the doorframe, taking a step into the room. Goliath emitted a soft woof, a noise of acute concern. "And what do you know about what he thinks? You, who whispers to dogs for a living." "It's not about what he thinks. It's about what he feels. Constant stress. Isolation. Boredom. You've made him a mirror of your own security system, all threat, all the time." The words were out before she could cage them, born of days of silent observation and a fatigue that eroded caution. The atmosphere in the kennel froze solid. Sander crossed the distance between them in 2 swift strides. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He caged her against the cold concrete wall, one hand planted beside her head, his body not touching hers but close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, smell the clean, dangerous scent of his skin. Goliath let out a sharp, piercing bark and threw himself against the inner bars, the metal groaning in protest. "You presume," Sander hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her cheek, "to know anything about what I've made? About what this world requires?" His eyes were a blizzard now, furious and captivating. "You see a bored dog. I see a perfect defense. You see cruelty. I see necessity. Your soft little world of coupons and kindness is a fantasy. Out there," he jerked his head slightly, "the monsters don't whine about bitter supplements. They tear out throats." Juliet's heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but she didn't shrink back. The wall was cold and unyielding against her spine. She held his stormy gaze, and in a voice that was low but remarkably steady, she said, "I know more about monsters than you think, Mr. Varga. The ones in alleys demand money. The ones in palaces demand souls. At least the alley monsters are honest about what they are." For a long, suspended moment, he simply stared at her, his anger transmuting into something more complex, more heated. The proximity was a live wire. Her defiance was a spark. The animal in the cage was a roaring backdrop. He could see the pulse hammering in the delicate hollow of her throat, a betraying rhythm of fear, but her eyes gave away nothing but that same maddening calm. It was the most potent aphrodisiac he'd ever encountered, a challenge wrapped in stillness. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. The urge to crush that calm, to devour it, to make her feel the terrifying edge of the world he ruled was almost overwhelming. "You think you're safe because he doesn't growl at you," he murmured, the menace in his voice dropping to an intimate, threatening register. "The real monster isn't behind these bars, Juliet." He used her real name like a weapon, proving his knowledge, his reach. "He's the one who holds your debt. He's the one who decides if you ever see daylight again. Remember that the next time you feel like playing philosopher with my property." He pushed back from the wall abruptly, leaving her gasping for air. She hadn't realized she'd been denied. He turned to the kennel, and with a single, sharp command in a language she didn't recognize, he silenced Goliath. The dog immediately stilled, though his whole body quivered with anxious energy, his eyes darting between his master and the woman. Sander didn't look at her again. He strode from the kennel, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. Juliet slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her legs unable to hold her. The ghost of his heat, the imprint of his presence, seemed to linger on her skin. Her hands trembled now, the reaction he had wanted but hadn't stayed to see. Goliath, across the room, let out a long, shaky exhale that sounded almost human. He lay down again, his head on his paws, his dark eyes fixed on her. There was no growl. There was, she thought with a dizzying clarity, something that looked like a shared understanding. In that charged confrontation, a new, dangerous triangle had been formed. The master, the weapon, and the woman who, with a few quiet words, had reminded them both that there were different kinds of strength, and different kinds of cages. The beast in the man had been provoked, and the man had found, to his own fury and fascination, that the beast in the dog was no longer solely his to command. The estate, Juliet discovered, was not a monolith of concrete and surveillance. On her third week, during the prescribed 1-hour grounds exercise for Goliath, a tense, leash-walked circuit on a paved path under the watchful eyes of armed men on a parapet, she glimpsed a sliver of green behind a crumbling brick wall, a door left slightly ajar on a rusted hinge. It was a forgotten place, a relic from whatever property had stood here before Sander's fortress rose. The next day, on a reckless impulse born of suffocation, she guided the massive dog toward it. The guard on the wall shouted a warning, but she called back, Mr. Varga approved an extended perimeter for behavioral enrichment. The lie, delivered with the flat calm she'd perfected, was met with uncertain silence. She pushed the creaking door open. Beyond lay a lost world. It was a walled garden, long neglected. Rose bushes grew in wild, thorny tangles, their blooms faded to ghosts of pink and white. Ivy choked a derelict fountain, where a stone cherub held a broken urn. The flagstone path was cracked and tufted with resilient weeds, but the enclosure was secure, the walls high and thick. Sunlight, unfiltered by the usual tension, dappled the ground. Goliath stopped at the threshold, his nostrils flaring, processing 1,000 new, non-threatening scents, damp earth, rotting leaves, wild mint. Juliet unclipped the leash. It was a breach of every protocol, an act of insanity. The dog stood frozen for a moment, confused by the sudden absence of restraint. Then, some deep, buried instinct, untouched since puppyhood, stirred. He took a tentative step onto the grass. She did not know that her approved extended perimeter lie had triggered a silent alarm in the security room, nor that the feed from the garden soul, moss-covered camera had flickered to life on the main monitor. Lysander Varga had been in a tense meeting with his captains, the air thick with the smoke of cigars and murmured threats about Mikhail's movements at the docks. He'd excused himself, drawn by the alert, and now stood motionless before the screen, a forgotten glass of bourbon in his hand. He watched the beast, his beast, the creature that had inspired whispers of demonic possession, chase its own shadow. He watched it roll onto its back in a patch of sun, all four massive paws in the air, wriggling with a pleasure so basic it was sacred. He watched the woman, Juliet, sit on the edge of the dry fountain, her face turned to the sun, a faint, unguarded smile touching her lips. It was a smile he had never seen, had not imagined her capable of. It transformed her, softening the edges of her resilience into something that looked, for a fleeting second, like peace. In that secret, dying garden, she had somehow disarmed them both. The meeting reconvened, but Sander was distracted. Nikolai's voice, low and urgent, detailing the need for a show of force against Mikhail, seemed to come from far away. All Sander could see was the image of Goliath's trusting posture, the exposed belly. It was a vulnerability he himself would never allow. Later, after the men had filed out with promises of violence, Sander found himself walking the sterile halls, drawn not to his study or his weapons locker, but toward the rear of the estate. He arrived at the garden door just as Juliet was reclipping the leash to a tired, contented dog. They faced each other in the fading afternoon light, the rusted door between them. Goliath's tail gave a slow, heavy wag at the sight of his master, but he didn't strain. He leaned slightly against Juliet's leg, a gesture of casual proximity that sent a shocking jolt through Sander. "You lied to my guard," Sander said, his voice lacking its usual edge. He sounded almost curious. "I needed space that wasn't a cell or a cage," she replied, not apologizing. She met his gaze, the ghost of that sun-warmed smile still in her eyes. He did, too. Sander looked past her at the ravaged garden, the evidence of the dog's joy written in torn earth and flattened weeds. "This place is a liability. Walls can be scaled. Sightlines are poor. It's the safest place on the property for him," she said quietly. "Because here, he doesn't have to be a guard dog. He can just be a dog. A tired dog is a calm dog. Isn't that what you want?" He stepped through the doorway, into the green space. The air was different here, softer, carrying the scent of green growth and decay. He felt an incongruous pang of trespassing. Goliath came to him, nuzzling his hand, and Sander's fingers automatically scratched behind the dog's ears. The action was familiar, but the context was not. He was petting his weapon in a sanctuary provided by his prisoner. "What do you know about what I want?" he asked, the question less an accusation and more a genuine, weary inquiry. "I know you want loyalty. Unquestioning loyalty." She looked at the dog, then back at him. "But you've confused loyalty with fear. They're not the same thing. Fear makes creatures bite the hand that feeds them. Loyalty makes them protect it." Her words landed in the quiet garden with the weight of truth. They echoed Nikolai's warnings, but from a different angle. Nikolai spoke of her as a vulnerability, a distraction. She was speaking of the very foundation of his power. The silence stretched, but it was not the hostile silence of the kennel. It was the silence of two people, a captor and his captive, standing in a neutral, forgotten land, discussing the nature of control. "Mikhail is pushing at my docks," Sander found himself saying, the information spilling out as if testing her. "He sees a weakness. He's always looking for one." Juliet absorbed this, her gaze steady. "And you think showing him more of the same, more fear, more force, will make him stop looking? It's the only language he understands." "Maybe," she conceded. "Or maybe it's the only language you've ever spoken to him." She turned to leave, pulling gently on Goliath's leash. At the door, she paused. "The garden will be here tomorrow. We'll be here at 3. You can lock the door behind us if you choose." She left him standing alone amidst the wild roses and crumbling stone. He didn't lock the door. He stood there for a long time, the twilight deepening around him, the words of his consigliere and the words of the waitress warring in his mind. Vulnerability, Nikolai had said. But what she had just shown him in the garden, what she had forced him to see in his own dog, was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength, a terrifying one because it was not his to command. She had created a pocket of peace in his empire of dread, and in doing so, had shown him the flaw in its architecture. The realization was more disquieting than any threat from Mikhail. The true siege, he began to understand, was not at the docks. It was here, within his own walls, and it was being led by a woman with a quiet voice and a key to a forgotten garden. The air inside the private gaming room of the Aviary Club was thick with the cloying scent of expensive cigars, aged brandy, and unspoken threat. It was a masculine preserve of dark wood, green felt, and low gold light, where fortunes and lives were traded on the turn of a card. Tonight, the stakes were territories. Lysander Varga sat at the head of the baize table, a study in controlled tension. Across from him, Mikhail Volkov sprawled in his chair, a bear of a man with a jovial smile that never reached his cold, piggish eyes. His fingers, thick and adorned with heavy rings, toyed with a stack of chips. Between them sat other men, lieutenants and intermediaries, but the room held only two real points of gravity, Sander and Mikhail. And now, a third. Juliet stood beside Sander's chair, a living accessory in a simple, sleeveless black dress he had provided. It was cut to flatter but not to reveal, a subtle distinction that felt like another kind of uniform. Her instructions had been minimal, delivered by Nikolai with a grim finality, *stand. Be silent. Show no emotion. You are a demonstration of control. Goliath, a looming shadow of polished leather and muscle, sat at her left side, a living, breathing piece of Sander's personal arsenal. The dog's presence was a calculated escalation, a reminder that Sander's power was not just financial or political, but visceral, animal. She was a prop. She understood this with a crystalline, humiliating clarity. Her value tonight was her stillness, her obedience, the visible proof that Lysander Varga could tame not only wild beasts but defiant women. The heat of the room, the predatory gaze of the men, the weight of Goliath's leash in her hand, it all coalesced into a buzzing nausea at the base of her skull. She focused on a single crack in the wood paneling across the room, building a mental fortress around herself. The game proceeded, a dance of raises and calls, of subtle insults veiled as compliments. Mikhail was losing, and his jovial mask began to crack at the edges. His eyes, more frequently, wandered to Juliet. Not with lust, but with a sharp, analytical curiosity. A weakness, displayed so openly, was an anomaly in their world. "Your new pet is remarkably well-behaved, Varga," Mikhail rumbled during a dealer shuffle, his gaze lingering on Juliet's profile. "So quiet. Most things that beautiful make some kind of noise." Sander didn't look at her. He studied his cards. "Discipline is preferable to noise, Mikhail. In all things." "Is it discipline?" Mikhail pressed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Or is it fear?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a mock conspiratorial level. "The dog, I understand. But the girl, she has the eyes of a rabbit in a snare. Pretty, but destined for the stew pot." A flash of hot anger, sharp and sudden, cut through Juliet's numbness. She wasn't angry at the insult to herself, but at the smug certainty in his voice, the reduction of her entire being to a piece of meat. She felt Goliath shift beside her, a low vibration beginning in his chest. He was attuned to her, to the minute tightening of her grip on the leash. Sander's jaw tightened. "Leave the decor out of your commentary, Volkov. Your taste has always run to the gaudy." Mikhail laughed, a loud, booming sound that had no joy in it. He made a gesture to one of his own men, who stepped forward to refill his glass. The man, a hulking brute with a shaved head, deliberately brushed too close to Juliet, his elbow nudging her. It was a test, a small probe of the perimeter. Goliath reacted instantaneously. The low rumble erupted into a deafening, guttural snarl. The dog lunged forward, not a full attack, but a violent, jerking surge that pulled the leash taut in Juliet's hand, his teeth bared inches from the offending man's thigh. The room froze. Hands drifted toward hidden holsters. The brute stumbled back, his face pale. "Control your beast, Varga," Mikhail barked, half rising from his chair. But it wasn't Sander who moved. Juliet acted without thought. She didn't yank the leash. She didn't shout. She simply stepped into Goliath's space, placing her body between the dog and the room. She put her free hand on the side of his massive head, her fingers curling into the fur at his scruff. She leaned down, her mouth close to his ear, and uttered a single, whispered word, so quiet it was almost lost in the tense silence, *steady*. The effect was instantaneous. The snarl cut off. The terrible tension in the dog's body didn't vanish, but it coiled inward, redirected. He turned his head, pressing his muzzle against her abdomen, a gesture of seeking reassurance, his furious eyes still locked on the threat. The silence that followed was profound, ringing with shock. They had all seen the animal's fury. They had all, now, seen it banked by a touch and a whisper from the rabbit in the snare. Sander watched, a storm of conflicting emotions behind his eyes. The demonstration had gone off script, but it had achieved something far more potent. It wasn't just his control on display, it was her power over the thing he considered his ultimate weapon. The humiliation of Mikhail's man was a bonus, but the awe in the room was directed at her. Possessive pride, cold and sharp, welded with a fierce, unwanted protectiveness in his chest. He made a decision in that heartbeat. He couldn't let the moment be hers alone. The narrative had to be reclaimed. As the room remained suspended, Sander reached out. His arm snaked around Juliet's waist, and with a firm, undeniable pull, he drew her down onto his lap. She went rigid, a small gasp escaping her. The heat of his body, the solid strength of him beneath her, was a shock after weeks of distance and cold walls. He held her there, effortlessly, one arm a steel band around her middle, his other hand returning to his cards as if nothing had happened. His chin rested near her temple. He smelled of brandy and clean, dangerous malice. "As I said," Sander murmured, his voice carrying to every corner of the dead-silent room, his lips almost brushing her ear, "discipline. She has a way with creatures of all kinds. Now, are we playing cards, Mikhail, or are you financing your next shipment with theatrical reviews? The game resumed, the tension bleeding slowly into a wary, watchful normalcy. But for Juliet, the world had narrowed to the cage of Sanders' arms, to the feel of his heartbeat against her back, to the searing mix of shame and a treacherous, undeniable thrill that sparked in her veins at the sheer, public possession of the gesture. She was a pawn, a shield, a trophy, all at once. On the floor beside them, Goliath settled, his head on his paws, his eyes watchful, his loyalty now a tangled knot between the hand that fed him and the voice that calmed him. The line between performance and reality had not just blurred, it had been incinerated. In the ashes, something new and dangerously intimate had taken its first breath. The return to the estate was a journey conducted in a silence so profound it felt like a physical entity, a third passenger in the back of the armored sedan. Sanders sat beside her, a brooding monolith of contained energy, the scent of cigar smoke and aggression clinging to his clothes. He had not released her hand after helping her from the car, a courtly gesture that was anything but, and his grip remained firm as they ascended to the main wing, bypassing the staff corridors. He was leading her into the heart of his domain, away from her cell. The message was clear, the performance was over, but the audience of one remained, and he was not satisfied. He took her to his private quarters. The space was a reflection of the man, vast, minimalist, dominated by a wall of glass looking out over the moonlit grounds. There were no personal touches, no photographs, only sleek furniture, a fireplace of black slate, and the faint, clean smell of him everywhere. He released her finally, walking to a sideboard to pour 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to her. She took it, her fingers numb, but did not drink. "You spoke," he said, his back to her as he looked out the window. "You were told to be silent." "He provoked the dog," she replied, her voice sounding thin in the expansive room. "I prevented an incident." "You commanded my dog." He turned, his eyes capturing the reflected moonlight, making them gleam like chips of ice. "In front of my enemies. You made a display of a control that is not yours to wield." The accusation hung in the air. The thrill of the club, the dangerous heat of his possession, had curdled into a cold dread. This was the reckoning. "I was protecting your asset," she said, holding his gaze. "As I was instructed to do." A slow, mirthless smile touched his lips. He set his glass down and crossed the room until he stood before her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You think this is about the dog?" he whispered, the menace back, intimate and chilling. "This is about you. The way you stood there, so calm. The way you looked at Mikhail, not with fear, but with contempt. You showed them a crack in my armor, and then you had the gall to seal it with your own 2 hands. You made them wonder who truly holds the leash." His hand came up, not to strike, but to trace the line of her jaw with his knuckles, a touch so light it was a violation. She flinched, but didn't pull away. There was nowhere to go. "I own you, Juliet Chen. Every breath you take is on my ledger. Every beat of your heart belongs to the debt I hold. Do you understand?" The words were meant to break her. Instead, they ignited a final, defiant spark. "You own my debt," she corrected, her voice trembling but clear. "You don't own me." It was the wrong thing, the right thing, to say. The last thread of his control snapped. The ice in his eyes melted into a blazing, possessive fury. He closed the final inch between them, his mouth crashing down on hers. It was not a kiss of affection, or even of desire in its pure form. It was a conquest. A branding. It was violence and hunger fused into a single, devastating act. She struggled, a brief, futile push against the immovable wall of his chest, but his arms banded around her, one hand tangling in her hair to hold her still, the other splayed against the small of her back, pressing her into him. The taste of him, brandy, power, wrath, invaded her senses. It was a battle, and she was losing, her body betraying her will, a traitorous heat pooling low in her belly, a weak sound escaping her throat that was not entirely one of protest. He walked her backward, never breaking the brutal seal of his mouth, until the backs of her knees hit the edge of the massive bed. They fell onto the silken duvet in a tangle of limbs and desperate energy. His hands were everywhere, claiming, exploring, tearing at the fabric of the dress he'd given her. It was not tenderness. It was a furious, consuming need to erase every other thought, every other claim, every shred of her defiance, and replace it with only him. To prove, on the most primal level, the truth of his words. And somewhere in the storm, her defiance transformed. The fight didn't leave her, it changed channels. Her nails scraped down his back, not to push him away, but to pull him closer. Her mouth opened under his, not in surrender, but in a challenge met. She bit his lower lip, and he groaned, the sound vibrating through her. It was a war where every surrender was a victory, every gasp a counterattack. The line between hatred and need, between captivity and collusion, dissolved in the dark, heated space between their bodies. When he finally entered her, it was with a sharp, claiming thrust that drew a ragged cry from them both. There was pain, a searing fullness, but it was subsumed by a shocking, all-consuming intensity. He moved with a ruthless, driving rhythm, his eyes locked on hers, demanding she witness her own unraveling. And she did. She watched him watch her as pleasure, sharp and shocking, began to tear through the anger, building like a wave from the very core of the conflict between them. She came with a sob, her body arching under his, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his shoulders. He followed moments later, his own release a shuddering, silent roar against her throat, his teeth grazing her pulse point. The silence that descended was louder than any snarl. The room was cold. The moon cast stark shadows. He rolled off her, lying on his back beside her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The scent of sex and sweat and shattered boundaries filled the air. Juliet stared at the dark ceiling, her body humming, her mind a white, static void. What had she done? What had they done? The transaction was now irrevocably corrupted. She was no longer just a debtor. She was a lover, or something stained and dark that approximated it. After a long while, Sander rose without a word. He disappeared into the adjoining bathroom. She heard the shower run. She lay there, exposed and trembling, until he returned, dressed in dark lounge pants, his hair damp. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, the storm spent but the landscape forever altered. Without meeting his eyes, she slid from the bed, gathered the ruins of her dress, and held it against herself. She walked, naked and shaking, to the door. He didn't stop her. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her, not cold, not warm, but thick with a new, confusing tension. The garden. Tomorrow. At 3. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, but one that acknowledged the shift. She didn't reply. She opened the door and slipped out into the cold, silent hallway, making her way like a ghost back to her sterile room. When the lock engaged behind her, it sounded different. It was no longer just locking her in. It was locking the memory of his touch, his taste, the terrifying power of her own response, inside with her. The cage was the same, but the prisoner had changed. She had tasted the keeper, and a part of her, a part she feared to acknowledge, had hungered for more. The debt remained, but it was now laced with a darker, more binding currency, a passion forged not in love, but in a war of wills that had found its most intimate, devastating battlefield. A fragile, treacherous détente settled over the estate in the days that followed. The air between Sander and Juliet crackled with a new, unspoken language, a glance held a beat too long, the accidental brush of a hand in the hallway carrying the memory of that night's fire. He did not summon her to his bed again, but his presence was a constant, subtle pressure. He would appear at the garden during her appointed hours, not speaking, simply watching her with Goliath, his expression inscrutable. Sometimes he brought a book of his own, sitting on the opposite side of the derelict fountain, the three of them existing in a silence that was no longer hostile, but thick with unresolved tension. He sent things to her room, not jewels or finery, but books on botany, a new, softer blanket for the kennel floor, a set of high-quality leather grooming brushes. They were not apologies, they were markers, a silent cataloging of her influence. Each gift felt like a brick in a gilded cage she was somehow helping to build. Goliath, in this strange new world, became the barometer of their shifting dynamic. The dog now greeted Sander with a relaxed wag, but would inevitably wander back to press against Juliet's side, his loyalty a divided, but peaceful, country. He was thriving. His coat gleamed, his eyes held a calm intelligence instead of a perpetual threat. He was the living, breathing proof of her theory, and Sander could not ignore it. The weapon was still formidable, but it was no longer a creature of pure, undirected rage. It was something more complex, and therefore, in its own way, more dangerous. This fragile piece was shattered not from within, but from the outside, through the most predictable of cracks. Raphael, Juliet's brother, left alone in the city with his shame and fear, had been a simmering pot of guilt. The sight of his sister being driven away by the elegant, terrifying man had broken something in him. He wanted to be her hero, to sever the gilded leash he believed she wore. In his desperation, he sought out the only source of opposition he knew, Mikhail Volkov's crew. He offered them whispers, things he'd overheard Juliet say in her sleep when they shared the apartment, her worries about Sanders' docks, her fear of a man named Nikolai. It was incomplete, childish intelligence, but in the hands of a strategist like Mikhail, it was a spark. He saw not information, but opportunity. The brother of Varga's new favorite was a weapon begging to be used. The attack came on a rain-slicked evening. Sander was taking Juliet to a private holding of his, an art storage facility he used for sensitive meetings. It was meant to be a display of trust, a further unraveling of the boundary between prisoner and confidant. Goliath lay in the fortified back of the armored SUV. Nikolai was in the front passenger seat, the driver another trusted man. They were 2 blocks from the estate when a garbage truck veered sideways, blocking the narrow street. Simultaneously, a van screeched to a halt behind them, sealing the exit. Ambush! Nikolai barked, his hand already on his weapon. Chaos erupted. Men in black balaclavas poured from the van, their guns barking, the spang of bullets ricocheting off the armored vehicle deafening inside the cabin. The driver hit the gas, ramming the garbage truck, but the weight was too great. They were pinned. "Stay down!" Sander roared, shoving Juliet to the floor as the window beside her starred into a spiderweb of cracks. He drew a pistol from a shoulder holster, his face a mask of cold fury. But the angles were bad, they were fish in a steel barrel. Then, a new sound pierced the chaos, a frantic, electronic whine from the back. Goliath, driven into a frenzy by the gunfire, the scent of blood, and the palpable fear of his humans. The partition separating the back compartment was not designed to hold back a panicked, 140-pound Corso. With a screech of tearing metal, the dog forced his way through, a black bolt of rage and terror. He didn't go for the attackers. He placed his body over Juliet, who was curled on the floorboards, a living shield. A muzzle flashed at the shattered window. The report was different, closer. Goliath let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp and collapsed heavily onto her legs. "No!" The scream was torn from Juliet, raw and guttural. She scrambled from under the dog's weight. His side was a mess of dark, spreading wetness. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Something in Sander shattered. The cold tactician vanished. A raw, primitive roar of rage tore from his throat. He kicked the door open, using it as a shield, and fired with a terrifying, precise frenzy. Nikolai and the driver joined the fray from the other side. The ambush, designed for capture or a quick kill, buckled under the unexpected ferocity of Sander's counterassault. The attackers began to fall, and the survivors melted back into the rainy gloom as quickly as they had appeared. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of rain, the moan of the wounded driver, and the agonized, shallow panting of the dog. Sander didn't check the bodies. He shoved his still-smoking gun into its holster and dropped to his knees in the filthy wet street beside the open car door. His hands, those elegant, lethal instruments, went to Goliath's wound, applying pressure. Blood, shockingly red, welled up between his fingers. "Nikolai! The estate! Now! Call the vet!" Sander's voice was stripped bare, all pretense gone, revealing a core of sheer, desperate will. He looked at Juliet, her face white, her hands fluttering over Goliath's head, whispering nonsense words of comfort. In that moment, she saw it, the man beneath the boss. The boy who might have once loved a dog before the world forced him to turn it into a weapon. It was a vulnerability more intimate than anything she had seen in his bed. Somehow, they got the massive, limp dog back into the SUV. They raced to the estate, where a terrified veterinary surgeon was already waiting in a sterile medical room Sander maintained. For an hour, Juliet and Sander waited in the hallway, both painted in Goliath's blood. She leaned against the wall, shaking. He paced like a caged panther, his bloodied hands clenched into fists. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. The only sound was the frantic scrape of his shoes on the polished floor. Finally, the vet emerged, wiping his hands. The bullet missed the major organs. It's a deep muscle wound. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong. He'll live. The breath left Sanders' body in a shuddering rush. He closed his eyes for a moment, then gave the vet a curt nod. Keep him sedated. Whatever he needs. Only when the vet had scurried away did Sander turn to Juliet. The relief in his eyes hardened into something glacial and sharp. The vulnerable man was gone, buried again. In his place was the boss, and he had just connected the dots. They knew the route, he said, his voice low and deadly. They knew it was just one car. Not a convoy. They knew where to hit us. This wasn't a random probe. He stepped closer, the scent of blood and gunpowder clinging to him. Your brother. He's been seen talking to Volkov's lieutenants. Selling scraps of his sister's pillow talk for pocket money and a chance to play the hero. Juliet's world tilted. Raphael? No, he wouldn't. He did. The words were final, a judge's pronouncement. His betrayal has my dog lying on a surgery table and my driver with a bullet in his shoulder. His betrayal could have gotten you killed. He reached out, his blood-stained thumb brushing a smudge from her cheek, the gesture grotesquely tender. He is a liability. A rat. And in my world, we have a very specific way of dealing with rats. The terror that gripped her now was colder, deeper, than any she had felt for herself. It was the primordial fear for one's kin. She saw in his eyes the truth of it. Raphael would be tortured for every perceived secret, then drowned in the river, a message to all. Please, she whispered, the word tearing from a place of utter despair. Sander, please. He studied her face, the tears cutting through the blood on her cheeks. He saw not just her fear, but the total annihilation of the fragile trust they had built. And he saw a use for it. A cruel, definitive use. Silas will have him by morning, Sander said, naming his most feared enforcer. Unless. She clung to the word. Unless what? His gaze was merciless. Unless you publicly prove, beyond any doubt, where your loyalty lies. You are mine. Every part of you. I need you to show my organization what that means. You will stand before my captains. You will kneel. And you will pledge yourself, not as a debtor, but as a possession. A willing one. It was a choice between her brother's life and her soul. A ritual of ultimate submission to save the boy who had thrown her to the wolf. The irony was a bitter poison in her mouth. She looked toward the medical room where Goliath slept, the animal who had taken a bullet for her, the living symbol of this twisted world. She had saved the beast. Now, to save the boy, she would have to become one. Yes, she said, the word hollow, her eyes devoid of light. I'll do it. He nodded, a satisfied, grim finality in the gesture. The bond between them, forged in passion and a strange, grudging respect, was now to be sealed in a public sacrament of humiliation and ownership. The garden was gone. The quiet moments of reading were ash. All that remained was the brutal economy of the world he ruled, and she had just agreed to pay its highest price. The great hall of the Varga estate was a place Juliet had never seen. It was a cavernous space of stone and timber, more medieval keep than modern home, lit by wrought iron chandeliers that cast a flickering, judgmental light. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke, old whiskey, and the musk of powerful, dangerous men. They were all there, Sander's captains, his lieutenants, the hardened faces of his empire. They stood in a loose semicircle, their silence more intimidating than any roar. At the center of the space, on a simple, high-backed chair that was not quite a throne, sat Lysander Varga. He was dressed in severe black, his expression carved from granite. To his right stood Nikolai, his face an unreadable mask of solemnity. To his left, a space had been left empty. Juliet waited in an antechamber, a small, stone room with a single slit of a window. She wore another dress provided by Sander, this one of deep burgundy velvet, simple in cut but rich in texture. It felt like a costume for a sacrifice. A woman she didn't know had braided her hair in an intricate, severe style that pulled at her temples. She had been instructed. She was to enter when summoned. She was to walk to the center of the room. She was to kneel. She was to speak the words that had been given to her. There was to be no hesitation, no emotion. It was a performance, and her brother's life was the ticket. From the hall, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the clink of glass. Goliath was still in the medical wing, sedated and healing. She wished for his solid presence beside her, even as she hated the world that had created him. The door to the antechamber opened. Nikolai stood there. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. She walked into the hall. Every eye locked onto her. The murmur died instantly. The weight of their collective gaze was a physical pressure, a scrutiny that stripped her bare far more effectively than any lack of clothing. She kept her chin level, her eyes fixed on Sander, who watched her approach without a flicker of warmth. The click of her heels on the stone floor echoed like a heartbeat in the silent cavern. She stopped before him, the prescribed 5 paces away. The air between them crackled with the memory of blood and intimacy, now frozen into this terrible ritual. She could see the cold expectation in his eyes, the unyielding demand of the boss. This was the price. This was the proof. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself to her knees. The cold of the stone seeped through the thin fabric of the dress, a shock that grounded her in the nightmare. She placed her hands on her thighs, palms up, a gesture of offering, of vulnerability. The room held its breath. She raised her eyes to his. His face was impassive, but she saw the intense, focused fire in his gaze. He was waiting. She opened her mouth, and the rehearsed words, dry and bitter as ash, emerged. I, Juliet Chen, come before you of my own will. The lie tasted foul. I acknowledge the debt of life owed for my brother's betrayal. I pledge my loyalty and my service to you, Lysander Varga, not as an obligation, but as my choice. My hands are yours. My will is yours. From this moment, I am yours to command. The words hung in the smoky air. They were the words of a vassal, of a surrendered enemy. A soft, approving murmur rippled through some of the men. They saw a beautiful woman brought to heel, a public consolidation of their boss's power. A symbol of absolute control. Sander watched her, and for a fleeting second, she saw something fracture in the granite of his expression. It wasn't triumph. It was a profound, unsettling conflict. He saw the light die in her eyes as she spoke. He saw the proud, defiant woman who had calmed his beast with a whisper broken into a reciting doll. He had demanded this, had orchestrated it to save a worthless boy and to cement his authority, but the reality of it, her utter, public abasement, felt like a loss. A deep, hollow victory. He stood. The room fell silent again. He walked the few steps to where she knelt. He drew a dagger from his belt, a slender, ancient-looking thing with a jet-black handle. A gasp, quickly stifled, came from the crowd. This was not part of the script she knew. He took her left hand in his. His touch was firm, warm against her cold skin. He turned her palm upward. With the tip of the dagger, he made a quick, shallow cut across her palm. She didn't flinch, only watched as a line of bright red welled up. Then, to the stunned silence of the room, he did the same to his own palm. He clasped her hand, their blood mingling, his grip tight enough to make the cut sting. Bound, he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the farthest corner, but his eyes only on her. By blood and by choice. Your life for his. Your loyalty for my protection. Witnessed. It was more, and less, than the pledge. It was a dark marriage contract, sealed not with a kiss, but with a shared wound. He released her hand. A single drop of their mingled blood fell to the stone between them. It is done, he announced to the room. The matter is closed. The brother lives. Let there be no more discussion of it. He offered her his hand, not to help her up, but in a gesture of possession. She placed her bleeding hand in his, and he drew her to her feet. The audience, understanding the show was over, began to disperse, the low murmur returning, now laced with a new, wary respect for the woman who had just been bound to their king in blood. He led her from the hall, not back to her cell in the staff wing, but up a sweeping staircase to his private quarters. Once inside, the door closed on the world, he released her. The performance was over. They were alone with the aftermath. He went to a cabinet, fetching a cloth and a small bottle of antiseptic. Without a word, he took her hand again and began to clean the cut, his touch now clinical, his brow furrowed. The silence was deafening. Why, she finally asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The blood. That wasn't part of it. He didn't look up. Words are cheap. Blood is a ledger that never closes. He finished tending to her hand and roughly bandaged it. Then he turned away, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to her. She took it, the glass cold against her uninjured palm. He'll live, Sanders said, his back to her. Your brother. He'll be sent away. Somewhere he can't do any more damage. He'll have a job. He'll be watched. But he'll live. It was a mercy, of a kind. A ruthless, controlled mercy. She should have felt relief. All she felt was a numb, hollow exhaustion. He turned, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in the dress, the braids, the pallor of her face. You think I wanted that? He asked, his voice low, stripped of its public authority. You think I enjoyed seeing you kneel on that stone? You demanded it. I did. He took a long drink. Because this world doesn't understand forgiveness. It only understands power and sacrifice. You gave them a sacrifice. Now, they will never question your place. Or my hold on you. He moved closer, his gaze intense. But that wasn't you kneeling. That was a character. A shield. He reached out, his fingers gently undoing the tight braid at her temple, loosening her hair. It was an act of shocking intimacy after the public brutality. The woman who stood up to me in the kennel, who read poetry to a killer dog, who looked at Mikhail with contempt, that woman doesn't kneel. Not truly. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. I didn't break you tonight, Juliet. I had to make it look like I did. There's a difference. In that moment, she saw the terrible, lonely burden of his crown. The constant calculus of cruelty and protection, of spectacle and survival. He had forced her into a role to save a life and secure his own position, but in the privacy of this room, he was acknowledging the lie of it. He was confessing, in his own twisted way, that the part of her he valued was the part that would never truly kneel. The hatred she had nurtured bled away, leaving behind a terrifying, complex void. He was a monster. But he was her monster now, bound by a bloody pact she had chosen to make. The debt was no longer about money. It was about something infinitely more binding and dark. She looked at their bandaged hands, the matching wounds. The line between captive and accomplice had not just blurred, it had been severed, and in its place was a tether, woven from threat, sacrifice, and a shocking, undeniable strand of something that felt, in the deep silence of the night, perilously close to understanding. The silence after the blood oath was not peace, it was the tense, humming quiet of a drawn bowstring. The estate became an armed camp. Mikhail's failed ambush and the very public display of Juliet's binding had escalated a cold war into one simmering on the brink of inferno. Sanders' men moved with a new urgency, their eyes sharp, their conversations hushed. The garden stood empty, a paradise forsaken. Juliet moved through the fortified halls like a ghost, the bandage on her palm a constant, tactile reminder of her choice. She visited Goliath daily, sitting by his recovery crate as he slept, her quiet voice the only medicine she could offer. The dog's slow healing was a mirror for the estate itself, wounded, vulnerable, and radiating a dangerous, pain-born fury. Sander was a constant, brooding storm cloud. He spent hours in his war room with Nikolai and his captains, maps and surveillance photos spread before them. The intelligence was grim, Mikhail was consolidating, calling in favors, making open challenges to Sanders' control of the waterfront. He was circling, sensing weakness. The weakness, every report implied, was the distraction in the East Wing, the woman whose brother had betrayed them, the woman who had cost them a key asset in Goliath, the woman the boss had bound to himself in a moment of perceived sentimentality. The whispers, once respectful after the kneeling, were turning critical. A king could not afford a queen with a traitor's bloodline. Juliet heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances from men like Silas, whose sadistic eyes now held a glint of opportunity. She understood the calculus. She was a liability that had become a target. Mikhail wouldn't just want to kill Sander, he would want to take what Sander had publicly claimed. Her capture or death would be the ultimate symbol of his rival's defeat. The attack, when it came, was not a street ambush. It was a full-scale assault on the heart of the beast. It began with a coordinated power outage, plunging the estate into a moonless dark. Alarms were silenced, communication lines cut, a sophisticated, insider-aided strike. Then came the explosions, not to breach the outer walls, but to create chaos at the main gate and the southern perimeter. Sanders' men, well-trained but suddenly blinded, scrambled to defensive positions they could no longer see. The sound of automatic gunfire tore the night into shreds, echoing through the stone corridors. Juliet was in her room when the world went black and loud. The lock on her door, electronic, disengaged with the power, leaving it sealed shut. She was trapped in a pitch-black box while a battle raged outside. She could hear shouts, screams, the terrifyingly close thud of bodies against walls. This was it. Mikhail's men were inside. The fortress had fallen. Then, a different sound, a frantic, powerful scrabbling at her door, followed by a deep, pained whine. Goliath. He had torn himself from his medical crate, stitches be damned. He was out there, in the dark and the violence, looking for her. The thought of him, wounded and confused in that carnage, acted like a lightning bolt to her paralysis. She was not a soldier. She could not fire a gun. But she knew this place. She had studied it not as a defender, but as a prisoner seeking pockets of air. She remembered the old, disused servants' passages Nikolai had once offhandedly mentioned were sealed off. She remembered the layout of the medical wing, the ventilation access she'd noticed while sitting with Goliath. Using the light from her now useless phone, she pried at the vent cover in her small bathroom. It gave way. The duct was tight, dusty, but passable. She crawled, guided by memory and desperation, the sounds of battle a muffled roar around her. She emerged into the medical storage room, then into the main recovery area. Goliath was gone, but a trail of fresh blood dotted the floor. She followed it, a silent shadow in the mayhem. She saw flashes of the fight, Silas, grinning wildly as he fired down a corridor, only to be cut down by a burst from the dark, Nikolai, backed against a wall, his silver hair a beacon in the muzzle flashes. She saw no sign of Sander. Then, she heard his voice. Roaring from the direction of the great hall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, but undercut by something else, the ragged edge of someone outnumbered and making a last stand. She didn't run toward the sound. She ran away from it, toward the kitchen wing. She burst into the cold, industrial pantry, and there, cowering behind sacks of flour, was the estate's young kitchen hand, a boy of maybe 16, trembling violently. The external fuel stores for the generators, she demanded, her voice cutting through his terror. The manual override to the secondary gates. Where? He stammered, pointing to a set of old iron keys on a hook, and a crude map etched inside a supply cabinet door. It was the estate's forgotten anatomy. She took the keys and ran. She didn't go to the generators. She went to the kennel. Using the heavy keys, she manually opened the outer gates of the run, then the main kennel door. Inside, she grabbed Goliath's heavy-duty leash and harness from its hook. Then, she did something utterly insane. She began to slam metal food bowls together, a deafening, clanging cacophony that echoed through the stone passages leading toward the great hall. She screamed, not words, just a long, high-pitched cry of sheer defiance. It was a distraction, a primal, noisy beacon. The gunfire in the hall stuttered, confused. Men from both sides turned toward the racket. From the darkness of a side passage, Goliath found her. He was limping, his side stained fresh red, but his eyes burned with a feral recognition. She didn't soothe him. She harnessed him, her hands steady. Find him, she whispered into his ear, her voice thick with command. Protect, asterisk. She unleashed the dog, not into the hall, but down the main corridor toward the estate's central electrical nexus, a room she'd located on the boy's map. She followed, still clanging the bowls. Goliath, driven by a lifetime of training to guard and her specific, urgent command, became a black nightmare streaking through the shadows. He didn't attack the first men he saw, he barreled past them, a force of nature headed for a specific, vital point. Mikhail's men, disoriented by the noise and the sudden appearance of the legendary beast they thought was dead, broke formation to fire at the blur, often hitting their own in the chaos. Juliet reached the nexus room. 2 of Mikhail's men were there, setting charges. She threw a metal bowl with all her strength. It missed, but the clatter made them spin. That second was all Goliath needed. He took the first man down at the knee with a sickening crunch. The second fired, wild, the bullet pinging off machinery. Juliet, acting on pure instinct, hit the large, red manual override switch for the estate's secondary security system, a network of internal shutters and reinforced doors meant to compartmentalize a breach. With a groan of long-unused machinery, steel shutters began slamming down throughout the estate, cutting the invading force into isolated pockets. The tide of the battle turned in that instant. Sander's men, knowing the estate's layout, now had the advantage. The sound of fighting became fragmented, then began to die away into moans and sporadic, final gunshots. Juliet slumped against the cold wall, the bowls falling from her numb hands. Goliath stood panting over the unconscious man, blood and droop dripping from his jaws. He looked at her, and in his eyes was no confusion, only a clear, fierce certainty. They had fought. Together. It was Sander who found her there. He emerged from the smoky darkness, his clothes torn, his knuckles raw and bleeding, a cut above his eye weeping blood. He held a pistol loosely at his side. He took in the scene, the downed men, the engaged shutter system, the wounded dog standing guard over the woman leaning against the wall. Understanding dawned in his exhausted, battle-hardened face. She hadn't fired a shot. She had used chaos as a weapon, knowledge as a key, and his own dog as a guided missile. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't pull her into his arms. He stopped before her, his gaze searching her face for injury, for judgment, for fear. He found none. He found only the same weary, defiant calm that had first captivated him in a restaurant over spilled wine. "You saved the asset," he said, his voice gravelly with smoke and emotion. "No," she corrected softly, looking at Goliath, then back at him. "I saved my home." The word hung between them, vast and undeniable. In that moment, the last vestiges of the transaction dissolved. The debt was not erased, it was transcended. She was not a captive, not a servant, not a bound possession. She was the woman who had turned his fortress's secrets against his enemies, who had fought for it as fiercely as he did. She was his equal in the only way that mattered in their bloody world, in loyalty, in cunning, in ruthless will. He extended his hand, not to take hers, but to offer his. It was still slick with blood, his own, his enemies'. It was a choice. A true one this time. Juliet looked at his offered hand, then at his eyes, where the winter sea had finally thawed into something raw and real. She placed her bandaged palm in his. Their wounds, old and new, pressed together. "Come," he said, his voice final. "Let's go home." He led her from the room, Goliath limping faithfully at their side, through the scarred but quiet halls of the estate they had, together, defended. The war with Mikhail was not over, but a new pact had been forged in the smoke and the blood, a dark, unbreakable tether of mutual survival and hard-won respect. It was not a fairy tale. It was something better, and worse, and infinitely more binding, a partnership forged in the shadows, where the line between monster and savior was forever blurred, and the only thing that mattered was the strength of the bond holding them together. Want to descend deeper into the underworld of passion and power? This tale of tangled loyalty and fierce love is just the beginning. Subscribe to stay in the heart of the darkness, where every whisper holds a threat and every touch could be a betrayal or a salvation. Your next obsession awaits.